I know that you work with the wonderful Will Buxton, who's a good friend of mine. I'll lay this out on the table. I had a good chat with him yesterday about you. I don't know if you're going to be worried about that or happy.
In one afternoon, I lost an entire body of work for the year. At this point, I'm renting a flat on my own. All the issues I know so many people listening will have gone through. You're thinking, how do I make ends meet? I was so nervous for what I said in Saudi Arabia that I was physically shaking.
Hi, I'm Mark Priestley. I spent 10 years working at the McLaren Formula One team with the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Raikkonen, Fernando Alonso, Mika Hakkinen. But those are just the drivers. I also worked with amazing people behind the scenes. Adrian Newey, Ron Dennis. They all taught me valuable lessons that I now know are not just applicable to Formula One. My mission with this podcast is to help you to think more like a Formula One team might think about the challenges you might face in life, on a personal level, on a business level, being a parent, social challenges that you face. I hope you'll take away some valuable lessons that will help you on your own journey towards high performance. Welcome to Pitlane Life Lessons. In this week's episode, I'm talking to F1TV's Laura Winter. We talk about her journey to get to Formula One, some of the surprising things she found when she got there, and the importance of things like having the right people around you, both in her job but also in life, as well as the need to be as prepared as possible for when the opportunity comes around. Laura, your journey to Formula One has been very different to mine in that for me, when I was growing up as a teenager, the destination was always Formula One. That was my dream. I know that for you, it's been a little bit different. It's been a sort of consequence of chasing a job, perhaps, or a career, hasn't it? So I'm really interested to give us a very brief overview of the stepping stones that got you to Formula One in the first place.
Oh, thank you. I will try and keep this as brief as possible. Growing up, I loved drama, theatre studies. I loved sport. I was a swimmer for 12 years competitively. So I was that weirdo in class who stank of chlorine and fell asleep in lessons after morning training. And I loved English as well. That was my strongest subject at school. So I guess my career has found a way to kind of bring all of those three things together. And I did plenty of work experience in radio, in television, in student media, and then ultimately got my first job working actually in social media and communication. So very much not presenting, not in front of a camera or even around television and radio and broadcast media. But I always knew that's what I wanted to do. And it was finding out a way to do it. And I think one thing that's become clear to me is there's no set path. So in a way that's very liberating because anyone can find their way to do it if they're good enough, but equally it's frustrating because you don't know which next step to take and how you're going to make it. But I did 2 years of comms and social media for the World Rowing Federation. I'd also started rowing at university as well. So sport basically was kind of the bloodline of my life. It's the beating drum for me, for sure. And then I did 2 years on a sports desk in sports journalism. And that's where I learned all of the tricks of the trade. That's where I learned all of my skills and honed them. And then from there, I decided to go freelance as a presenter. I had a few clients. I'd kind of been doing a bit of work on the side, namely the 2014 Commonwealth Games as a stadium presenter in netball. And then from there, it was just about getting more jobs, doing more work for more clients, and keeping a breadth of sport as well. So I worked predominantly in women's cycling and cycling for a number of years, but also was doing cricket, tennis, football, rugby, you name it, I would do it. But motorsport didn't become an option to me and wasn't kind of in the plan until 2019. I was asked to present 4 rounds of the World Rallycross Championship. And I sort of said yes and was really excited to do it, but did have to go away and Google what is rallycross because I'd never heard of it before. But I'm
said
always,
yes first and then figured it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm always up for saying yes to things as long as you then do that sport and the drivers, the athletes, the players justice when you go in to do the job. So motorsport for me was kind of almost not by accident. I kind of designed a way that I was then, asked to do this job, but it wasn't part of any plan I had. My plan was to keep presenting within sport and see where that took me. And I didn't have a plan, which in a way was a good thing because it meant that when motorsport and ultimately F1 came knocking, I was there to say yes immediately because I wasn't sticking to some 5-year plan that I thought I had to. I jumped at every opportunity I could. And from Rallycross, I was recommended to Formula One management as a track TV presenter. And then from there, began to get more and more opportunities within F1TV as that grew over the years and post-COVID and through the 2021 season as well. And I'm now lead presenter of the channel, which is still
amazing.
Ridiculous for me. I still can't really believe that that's the case. But it's been amazing. It's been amazing.
It's quite a journey. I mean, obviously sport was at the heart of all of that. So you obviously clearly had a passion for sport. You talked about competing in things like rowing early on. What was it about I get the sport bit, but what was it about the presenting side that was so appealing to you? Because I guess as a competitor, you could have gone on to a number of different roles. Even if you weren't competing at the highest level, there's training, there's coaching, there's, all manner of different roles within sport. What was it about presenting?
Yeah, I definitely was never good enough to compete. Let's put that out there right now. Those 12 years in the pool, I didn't quite get there. I think presenting to me speaks to... I love performing, but I think that sounds terrible. But I've always loved watching TV. I've been a bit of a TV nerd and like how television is made and how broadcasts happen. And I still am to this day. I love all the behind the scenes stuff. I love listening to a hard count in your ear. I love listening to the television director. So TV for me was always a bit of a passion subject, I guess. And then equally, I guess it speaks to the sort of the drama, the theatre studies side of me, where I did a lot of acting at school and tried to balance that alongside doing the swimming. I just feel most alive, I suppose, when I am presenting and when I'm doing my job. And I think it also speaks to something in me that I am such a perfectionist. So I think that's possibly why I also love sport, because perfection is impossible to attain regardless, but sport is that constant quest for absolute perfection, whether that's higher, faster, stronger, whether it's an individual, a team, and machinery all working together as one and having to create a perfect storm for the perfect performance. In a way, I see broadcasting the same as that. There's no one broadcast that's perfect, but when you get into a mode or a flow where you feel like anything could happen in the show and you've got it. Like that is quite an addictive feeling. And I think I've always said that presenting for me is a little bit like a drug. It's an addictive kind of rush and high. And you do one job and then you're like, I want to do that again. There's an addictive element to it. And you add that to sport for me, which again is, I absolutely love it. I'm addicted to it. Then that just kind of, all encapsulates the other and compounds the other.
I can totally relate. My background is within the team and particularly I was part of the pit stop crew. Massive adrenaline rush, of course, being part of a pit stop. And when I left the team, I remember thinking, how on earth am I ever going to replicate that or at least fill the void that adrenaline rush would have left? And I actually went into doing live television at times, presenting Formula E and some of the Formula One stuff. And the live element of that did exactly as you've just described. It replaced some of that adrenaline rush that I'd lost through the missing of pit stops. So I completely get that. When you look back at those stepping stones that got you to where you are today in Formula One, can you pinpoint any moments, either really good moments or really difficult moments, that you now look back on as being really important to help shape you into the person that is crushing what you do today at the top of this sport?
Oh, thank you. I think, so some of those really early jobs, so the 2014 Commonwealth Games, I call it a big break. It really wasn't a big break, but at the time it felt like I was going to the Commonwealth Games myself, competing. It felt like that was the pinnacle for me. And going there, I was a stadium presenter. And so you have everything we've just discussed about a live broadcast. You have the same, but you're just simply broadcasting to the stadium. But you are learning so much in that environment. You've got your ears in, you've got a director and a producer talking to you, you've got talk back, you're learning how to stand, you're learning microphone technique, you're learning how to act around the camera. There is so much you pick up on there. But at the time I did the Commonwealth Games, I actually was still working at the newspaper. So I sort of just dropped into conversation at the sports desk. I need about 10 days off in August. Is that all right? They were like, Probably not. It's like July. You probably know. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to take that time off. Like, you don't have to pay me, but I'm taking that time off. I was so determined to make it happen. And I remember I was presenting the final. It was an amazing final, sort of 5,000-6,000 people, I think, something like that in the stadium. And the next day, I travelled straight back and was back in at Monday morning, 9 a.m. And I remember I was writing copy. I think I was copying out a press release or something, turning it around for the paper on fishing or bowls. And with all due respect to fishing and bowls, they're just not quite my cup of tea. And I just remember thinking, I have to make presenting work, because that was the bug had well and truly bitten at that point. And I was like, I cannot go back. I have to keep forging on and find a way to do this. And then I think adversely, a sort of low moment was undoubtedly COVID. I remember a Tuesday afternoon, probably mid-March, start of April perhaps, and in one afternoon I lost an entire body of work for the year. At this point, I'm renting a flat on my own. All the issues I know so many people listening will have gone through. You're thinking, how do I make ends meet? How do I get money to live? Am I going to have to move back home with my mum, age 30 or whatever I was? Like, there was so much going through my mind. But what that time taught me, firstly, it was a really, actually in the end, lovely period that I got to spend in one place at home with friends and family, which, as you know from the job, you don't get to do that often.
Yeah.
And equally, it enabled me to pivot quite a bit in terms of what I had been doing to that point and where I wanted to go. So I knew at that point I wanted to work in Formula One. It gave me quite a lot of time to sit at home and research, and I was doing little bits of virtual work with them from home as well. So I was having a bit of FaceTime with the drivers. I did my own podcast as well. I'm sure everyone started a podcast in lockdown, but that enabled me to, I think, unleash a bit of a creative side as well, and a bit of autonomy over how I work. Instead of waiting for other people to employ me, I went out and tried to find ways in which I could make money, and I could present and broadcast and create on my own. And I also had a Instagram series, Instagram Live series. No one does Instagram Live anymore, but do you remember
it's very much
Thursdays,
a COVID thing, wasn't it?
Everyone was live on Instagram. I loved it. I did one called A Glass of Wine With, which basically I would sit and drink a glass of wine, and I had a sports person sitting with me, and we just answer audience questions. It's
great, isn't it?
I love that so much. And it kept me going through lockdown. It gave me purpose. It kept me fresh. It kept me kind of broadcasting to an extent. But that was a real, again, moment where I thought this could all be over. Really genuinely was looking at full-time work again. I did not see a way back into the sport, and COVID had no end date. It had no expiry date, did it? We didn't know when things were going to come back. So it was a tricky year, but one that ultimately, looking back, I learned a huge amount from.
Again, I can relate massively to that, because I had a similar experience. I was working at Sky Sports on Formula One at the time. I'd been doing the Formula E stuff, and it all dried up in the same way. Yeah. And I turned to YouTube rather than a podcast, but it was the same thing. It was having some control. When you're working in television, as you know, there's a director or a producer, somebody telling you, stand here, to some extent say this, there's some direction and some control over what you're doing. But when you turn to your, something like a podcast or YouTube, you have complete control over it. So it does breed that element of creativity. So I wonder, how much, I know for me it's helped massively, but I wonder how much that experience has shaped what you do now, because I've seen parts of your broadcast. I'm thinking particularly back to that amazing monologue that you did at the start of the Saudi Arabian weekend. Guys, I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. If you can take a very quick moment to like, subscribe, follow, leave me a comment or a 5-star rating, I would really appreciate it. It makes a massive difference to the podcast. I know that you work with the wonderful Will Buxton, who's a good friend of mine, and I'll lay this out on the table. I had a good chat with him yesterday about you. I don't know if you're going to be worried about that or happy.
No, happy, but happy and worried at the same time.
But and I'll reveal a few more things of what he said to me as we go through. But one of the things he did say was that he had so much love and time for that moment particularly. He said it was all off the cuff. It was unscripted. It was you just saying what you thought from the heart. And I wonder if, those moments back in COVID where you had the freedom to just say what you felt and do what you felt might have been a real part of that. Because if you hadn't had that experience, I wonder how able or free you'd have felt to do that.
Yeah, I think as we were talking before and you were saying about how you had the creativity when you were on your YouTube channel to broadcast in the way you wanted, that really resonated with me as well. I think it enabled me to present in a way that was so much more myself after COVID, because my worst fear being a freelancer was that I would end up with no work, that I wouldn't be working. And that fear became a complete reality and so abruptly and brutally in 2020. And so once your worst fears realised, you've got nothing left to lose in a sense. So I really felt that it kind of enabled me to then start broadcasting with a lot more freedom and creativity and bringing so much more of myself as well to broadcast. And Will helped an enormous amount with that. He was like, you're a great broadcaster, but you're not, the Laura that I see off camera isn't the Laura that we see necessarily when we're on camera. And I said, well, I can't bring the Laura down the pub with a bottle of wine in it. And he was like, no, just find a middle ground. And that's ultimately what, I've done, but it comes on to what my lesson is going to be at the end, actually. So I won't give too much away, but it's about finding people around you who enable you and celebrate you being the very best version of yourself and being yourself and giving you that freedom as well. And Will is very kind. I have to admit though, the speech, it was scripted, but it wasn't read. So I'd written a script and then actually I went wildly off script during it because I was so nervous for what I said in Saudi Arabia that I was physically shaking when I was walking to the show. And I used to get incredibly nervous when I first broadcast, and I don't so much now. I still do, but it's more of an excitement. But for that one, I felt like I was walking to my execution. I was so nervous because I just knew what I had to say really meant a huge amount to me. I hoped it would mean a lot to people listening. And I felt it was something that had to be said at that time. And it was important. And I'm not saying sport isn't important. Sport is so important. But sometimes there are things that are more important than who wins and who finishes second. So
absolutely right.
I had learned a script, but I did not stick to it. And I can tell at one moment in it where I'm going, where am I going with this now? My eyes go wide. But no.
Do you feel like you're a different presenter since that moment because of the sort of because of that moment where you literally laid everything out on the line to some extent? It was literally speaking from the heart, from what we could all see and tell, and it's been responded to in the most incredible way. Do you feel like you're now a different presenter after that moment? Is it a sort of watershed moment to some extent?
Very good question. I think I don't think how I present has changed in terms of what I do and how I communicate and the questions I ask and all of that stuff. I think I feel a greater responsibility as a broadcaster since that. As I said, I knew it was going to be important, but I had absolutely no idea that it would be reacted to in the way it was. And I had no idea that it was going to speak to so many people, and women and men and boys and girls all got in touch, and everybody, and then on the other side of the coin, a fair few people who disagreed got in touch.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
But I think now I do feel a responsibility in presenting. But I think to an extent, I always have felt a responsibility to stand up for what's right and a pressure to kind of make sure that I'm on the right side of history to an extent, and say I'm not very good at pretending things are okay if they're not. I'm not very good at standing there smiling if I know that things aren't right. And there's just no way on International Women's Day I could have stood there and smiled and said, it's time for FP3. I just couldn't do it. It would have just been, for me, it would have gone against so much of what I stand for. So I think I bear that responsibility and pressure now, but not in a way where it's a burden. It is a privilege, and it was a privilege to have that platform and to be supported and able to say what I wanted to say. And I'm very truly humbled, still completely humbled, and very honoured by the reaction as well.
Yeah, well, hats off to you, because
Thank you.
it was amazing. It was a genuine goosebump moment, I think, for a lot of people, me included.
And me,
Do you
my
think
heart
you
was
were?
literally like my heart was going to explode.
I'm sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very brave thing to do. And do you think you were? Were you that brave in your earlier life? Were you that brave at school? Did you stand up to the bullies? And were you that kid? Have you always kind of stood up for what you think is right? Because I know it's an easy thing to say yes to, but it's also a really difficult thing to do at times, particularly in amongst peer pressure as kids.
I think I've always felt a strong sense of right and wrong. And when something is wrong or unfair or unjust, I've always been the one to kind of like go, what? Why? I've done that since I think I was young, for sure. And then I very naively grew up, not even thinking that my gender was any sort of barrier to me doing anything. And my gender would not play a part in how I was perceived in the world. And maybe I'm very lucky in that sense that my parents brought me up and I was in a sport like swimming where male and females are completely equal and able to do as they want and whatever they want. And so I think when I got to sort of 18, 19, and I began to see that the way that the sport was covered, the way that women's sport and men's sport is covered is very different. The way that women and men are treated in sport is incredibly different. There's a vast gap in terms of coverage. I did kind of make it a bit of a life mission of mine to try and readdress that balance in the best way I could. And working in women's cycling for a number of years when I first came into presenting and broadcasting was a huge part of that. We were trying to readdress a balance, give the female cyclists the recognition and coverage they deserve. And actually, I'm annoyed at myself for even saying women's cycling and men and cycling, because it's all just cycling and it's all just sport. And yes, there are different nuances to a sport, but fundamentally, all sport is good sport. I can be entertained by a schoolgirls hockey match or a schoolboys rugby match as much as I'll be entertained by the Olympic Games, because that's how I feel about sport. It's an incredible, amazing thing to watch and to buy into. And so, I think I have always felt a need to readdress the rights and wrongs of the world.
Well, good on you.
For my sins, maybe at times, it's sort of, I can't let things go sometimes, but
It can be tough, particularly in the professional world, can't it? Because it feels like there's an awful lot of pressure to just fit in and to carry on doing things the way everyone else has been doing them.
Keep the work, not speak out or whatever. Absolutely. And I think I can feel that as well. So it's about towing that line. But as I said, there was just no way I was going to let this one go.
Well, good on you.
Thank you.
One of the other things that Will said to me yesterday was, no, this is all good as well. It's all good, just to set your mind at rest. He talked about, you mentioned actually the responsibility that comes with your role, or the responsibility you feel, given there's a lot of people watching and listening, and you're telling the story of what's happening. You're a storyteller, effectively, aren't you? You're telling the story of what's going on through a Grand Prix weekend. Will mentioned to me, I think it was your first weekend at a Grand Prix event, but correct me if I'm wrong, which was a really difficult weekend. It was that weekend in Spa when we unfortunately had the tragic death of Antoine Hubert. And that, I think I'm right in saying, was your first moment of... I know were you doing F1TV, or were you doing the sort of track side?
Yeah, track TV and international feed interviews as well.
And one thing Will said to me, as it was one of the first moments, of course, you two had met and certainly had been in the same paddock together, was that you handled that moment with the most amazing sensitivity, empathy, thoughtfulness. And it struck me as being, if that's your first weekend in Formula One, that's your first weekend in that environment, which I can imagine is terrifying and scary in lots of different ways. And then you get hit with a moment like that, which you have to then tell the story of and convey to people at home or to people around the track as it was then. How on earth was that something that, I presume it was instinctive, but where does it come from? Because that empathy is quite an incredible thing when you've got the nerves of everything else that's running around you that weekend. I mean, what a baptism of fire to your career in this sport.
Yeah, it really was it was such a tragic weekend. I kind of saw the very best and worst of motorsport. I'd come in for the first time and we had 2 days where I was like, this is this is amazing. Like, I want to be doing this. You know, I just immediately was completely hooked and fell in love entirely with the paddock, with how things operated, everything about it. And then on the Saturday, of course, we lost Antoine Hubert in a horrific crash in F2. And I remember actually I felt desperately sad. I was in the pit lane as well, reporting for F2 at the time. So I will never forget the silence, because obviously a pit lane, is one of the noisiest places on earth. But the silence of everyone just looking at the screen and realizing what we just seen was not just your usual off or little shunt or what. This was a huge crash at one of the most dangerous corners areas in all of motorsport tracks. And so I immediately knew that this was more than just a crash. And what I felt most of all, I felt a sort of sense of guilt in a way, that I was brand new to the sport, but intruding so much then on the sport's grief and on my colleagues' grief and on the grief of those around me, because I didn't know Antoine, I didn't really know the team. At that time I was so brand new, I barely knew anybody. And so I was so acutely aware of that. And I think one of the earliest lessons in broadcasting that I've learned, which I probably really utilized then, was that it's not about you. When you're broadcasting, you are a conduit for the audience to find out what's happening or find out the opinion of a driver. It can be a bit about you. You can make your own personality shine through, but ultimately it's about the sport and who you're interviewing or who you're speaking to. And so I think that was very much for me what was going on the Sunday. Was, this is not about me, this is not about how well I can broadcast, this is about making sure my team around me get through this weekend the best they can, because they are grieving and the sport is grieving. And I think that's kind of one of the main ways I got through. But it was incredibly difficult, and I just felt an immense sadness, and I still do. I think that will always stay with me that weekend. And as an entry into Formula One, it was pretty brutal in that sense. But yeah, I mean, it was a tough weekend for sure. But one that, I managed to kind of just get through by respectfully towing that line between the show goes on an F1 race and honouring Antoine and his life.
Yeah, and as is often the case, sometimes the most difficult and the most tragic moments that we all go through are often the ones that give us some of these biggest bits of advice somewhere in there that we may not see in the beginning, but somehow come through, and the lessons we learn from it. And I have no doubt that moving forward, of course, you've moved from other sports like cycling, which I appreciate cycling can be dangerous, but it's much less likely in things like rowing and swimming and cycling. You're going to see a death over those weekends, and all of a sudden you have this, blimey, this is real serious life and death at times stuff. But having that lesson to grow the sensitivity or appreciate the sensitivity required, I have no doubt helps you through lots of moments that we now go through. Even if they're not life and death moments, they're often difficult moments, controversial moments, and they're all really important ones to deal with in the right way through sensitivity. As you said, you are relaying and retelling the story to the viewer, and telling it in the right way is the most important part of a broadcaster's job, I think. So there will undoubtedly be things you've learned. So that's, a one positive to take from what was a really difficult entry into the sport. I want to talk about preparation, because Formula One is all about preparation. I know from a team's point of view, we try and prepare as much as we can. We'd love to make it all an exact science that we have total control over, but of course it's never like that. I know, again, through talking to Will, I know how well prepared you are for doing your job. In fact, he described you as the most well-prepared presenter he's ever met. Wow. He says that you do your own research, you fact-check all of your own stats. A lot of people don't do that. Where does that come from?
Being a complete nerd at school, probably. Being like... it's that, and I think one thing that's going to sort of become clear in this podcast, I'm a perfectionist. So I constantly want to be better and be perfect. And I know that's not possible. And so I'll keep trying, basically. I don't think, it's not possible, so I'm going to back off. I keep trying. I also think we talk about that opening weekend that I went to with and the death of Antoine. It's also about respect for what these drivers are doing out on track. I have the utmost respect for how fast they are driving, the risks they are taking for our entertainment and for their careers. I think it's astonishing. And so I have that much of amount of respect for the sport, for the viewers watching, for the fans watching at home, because in F1 there are fans who know a hell of a lot about the sport, and you cannot stand there and go in half-baked, half-assed, not having done your research. And I knew I was coming into a sport that has so much history. There is so much to it. Something changes. There is something new every single weekend. There is some rule I didn't know existed that pops up most weekends. I am constantly learning, which I love. I love learning. I think it's one of the most important things. One of the best things that we can do as adults is to keep learning.
Yeah.
And I could not stand there and present if I wasn't prepared. I wouldn't feel comfortable. I wouldn't be able to really feel that I was able to be my full self, my best self, because I'd be half thinking, well, hang on, I don't know about that. I'm not sure about that. So, and don't get me wrong, Will's painted a wonderful picture of me, and I'm going to send him a bottle of champagne or something to say thank you. There are moments where suddenly something comes up and I go, I don't know that. And that's when I lean on the pundits around me, and you keep it simple and you keep it safe. But like I said, I love learning. I love making notes. So I don't put anything on computers or tablets or anything. I am pen and paper. I'm a pen and paper gal. So I write down everything. And when I write it, I feel that it goes into my head better. That's how I learn. I think that comes from school, from exams, right? Because look, I went to a grammar school, and if you didn't get 10 A stars or 10 A stars and A's at GCSE, you were deemed a bit of a failure. I did intermediate maths and got a B. So that's sort of the one thing, from school where I'm like, that was deemed a failure. But yeah, I've always been that kind of straight A student, and I guess it's that conscientious diligence that I don't know where it's come from, whether it's come from swimming and training and how hard I trained, whether one fed the other. I'm not sure, but it's how I've always approached everything, is to be completely prepared, and then you won't have any regrets.
How does that maths result still sit with you now? I mean, does it stick? The reason I ask is part of your meticulous preparation to do with either a sort of lack of confidence or to mitigate against failure? Is that, I don't mean about the maths results particularly, but to moments where you've had failures in life, do they stick with you and hurt and drive you towards trying to be more prepared in the future so it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And it will be a kind of lack of faith in myself, perhaps, sometimes, and what I know and my ability. And I know Will is an amazing cheerleader. I've got amazing people in my life who have to sometimes just reiterate, no, you're doing a good job. It's okay. And that's definitely lessened now. I feel much more sort of secure in who I am and my ability and what I can do. But certainly coming into it, I think you never feel quite good enough, do you? And it's that kind of imposter syndrome that keeps you coming back and fighting for more. So in a way, it's healthy, but it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it? Because it means you're never quite satisfied. With the maths result, though, actually, I was going through that rebellious phase at school when you're kind of 15, 16, and it's quite cool to be bad at something. So I was quite proud of the fact that I was demoted to bottom set maths with all the really naughty boys, and it was just me, and we were all laughing and joking. I think they all got C's and D's, but I probably
so
got
you were bad, but not that bad.
Yeah. I got the highest mark one could get in intermediate maths, which is a B. But no, I sort of wore that with a little bit of a badge of honour. Like, I'm actually, I'm a straight A student except for maths. But no, you're right. I think it comes down to wanting to be absolutely prepared so that if something goes wrong, you've controlled as much of the controllables as you can. And it's about, having, that faith and confidence in yourself that you know it, and you're good and you should be there, and you've earned the right to be there, which I do have to keep reminding myself sometimes.
Yeah, which is true of everybody. And I'm sure it's reassuring for people who watch you and you exude confidence on television, but it's reassuring to know that it's not always as polished underneath the skin as it might feel. You've mentioned a couple of times the team that you have around you on F1 TV. You've got this wonderful set of people, great set of presenters, and an amazing team behind the cameras as well. It's turned into a really big, really polished, really entertaining set of broadcasts that support Formula One. What have you learnt about the team members and the people that you have around you, not just in your job, but in life in general? How important is it to, collate the right people around you?
It's so important. I've worked in jobs where I felt like, oh my gosh, this will be my dream job. This will be the most amazing thing. And because you haven't got that team around you who you feel fully trust you or support you or have faith in you, the job itself falls flat, and perhaps your performance will therefore fall flat. In F1, I have a team around me who are so supportive and have full faith, I really hope, and feel safe with me on air, knowing that I'll get them out of whatever hole we get into. But equally, I feel safe with them. So the likes of Will, when Will and I broadcast together, I know that anything could happen and we'll be fine. And that's an amazing position to be in, because then that kind of lack of faith or that fear of live and what may happen, that could take up something like 40% of your mental capacity if you're thinking about everything that's going on. So when that's freed up, how much more can you give? You can give so much more. You can be so much more creative. You have so much more capacity to think and breathe and bring more into the broadcast. And I feel safe with Lawrence Barretto, with Alex Jakes, with Jolyon Palmer, with kind of that core team that we have on site with us, rotating in and out. I know that when I'm there, I can throw them any question, and we know each other well enough now that it'll be knocked back. James Hinchcliffe as well, absolutely brilliant. I know these guys, in how they broadcast, and I know that they will give an answer that can take us on to the next part. It just flows. And that's an amazing thing to have. That chemistry, I think, is probably a good word for it. The chemistry that we have on air, I absolutely love and cherish. I don't take that for granted, because it doesn't happen everywhere.
No, and it's exactly the same philosophy that applies to a Formula One team. With my experience, it's exactly the same. And it's, you can think about things like race strategy calls in a Grand Prix. And I always think back to Ferrari's sort of difficult years when they've had this tumultuous change in management constantly seemingly over years, coinciding with difficult results. And if you think about their communication at times with strategy and between the drivers and the pit wall, it was often a little bit hesitant. It was often a little bit, they were indecisive at times, it appeared. And when you look into that, I think a part of that was because the team environment, the culture wasn't quite perfect. There was something missing, something wrong. And therefore, you don't have that 40% you were talking about, the sort of the bit that's always thinking about, are we doing this right? Yeah. Are we good enough? Are we going to get berated for this if it goes wrong?
Yeah.
It stops you making the actual decision. And I think, Ferrari is wonderful. It's now changing under Fred Vasseur. Things are getting better in that sense. But you can look at the likes of Mercedes, where totally different culture during their dominant years always seemed to be very decisive. And I think having the right team around you in a Formula One team is exactly the same as what you're talking about, and actually in life in general, whether it's your relationships, your family, friend groups. They do give you that safety net to be able to feel free to make mistakes, don't they? If that's what, if that happens, and it happens to all of us. So hugely important. I want to just start wrapping this up, but I want you to give me two things that have sort of surprised you about Formula One since you've arrived. A good thing. So what's the best thing about Formula One, and what's the worst thing about Formula One?
There's not one best thing.
Or what surprised you, I guess, in a positive sense when you arrived?
I would say that the paddock is home. The paddock feels like a wider, extended, completely dysfunctional, weird family. And I think when you first come into the sport, and in my first few races, I felt like, oh my God, I don't know anybody. I'm never going to really fit in. Everybody knows each other. Everyone's got a rhythm and a flow to how they work, and I'm kind of sticking out a little bit like a sore thumb, and I don't know this and that about the sport, and they're going to think I'm underprepared and I'm stupid. Well, you kind of really overthink your position within the paddock, and you don't feel particularly welcome, and it can appear quite a sort of adrenaline fueled and quite like a masculine environment. But actually, there are unbelievable people in that paddock who I'm so lucky to know and to have made friends with, and they'll be pals for life. You know, they're just brilliant people. And also, I think I hold myself to such a high standard in my life in F1. That is the absolute bare minimum in that paddock. Everybody who works in there is so insanely talented, and that's very, very inspiring to be around as well. I think it's not really a surprise, but I suppose one of the things about F1 and the schedule is the travel. It can just be, and it feels so first world problems to complain, I have to go to F1 races in Australia. It's so, throw that at me. This is a big first world problem, but the schedule is pretty relentless. And I also marry that up with commitments and other sports and broadcasts outside of F1. So it's all my own making. My schedule is insane. It is completely mental. And I guess it's not a surprise, but you don't know how tired you're going to get until you're kind of like in Las Vegas and FP2 has been delayed 2.5 hours and you're suddenly like the weight of the season is on you and you just think, oh my God.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah.
And I suppose one other thing that can be a negative but equally can be a positive is that the online audience can be overwhelmingly amazing, and yet we do still have a small but very loud pocket, a minority, who are intent in believing and stating and telling everyone else they should believe that women don't have a role in this sport. And I think that does sadden me, but I see it across, all sports, and it's a bit louder with F1 because of the number of eyes on it. That saddens me. Sadly, doesn't really surprise me, I suppose. But hopefully that vitriol is getting less and less, or at least those who express it are being told in no uncertain terms, your belief is unacceptable, and that is not how a modern society works. So I guess, two of the things there that, not surprising. You get very tired and you get abuse online.
Well,
part of the job.
Yeah, part of the job, unfortunate, the abuse certainly and uncalled for. But I think just to go back to what you said about the positive side of that, the way that the paddock has embraced you and you've been slightly surprised, because it does feel like it might be a hostile environment, hugely competitive. But the reality is we see over and over again teams coming to the help of other teams. We saw a fire at McLaren the other day, and yet Mercedes then offered to feed the team. Same when Williams had their fire back in Barcelona. I actually think that idea of kindness is a real competitive advantage, both in Formula One, but also in business and in life. And it's a much overlooked one. We don't very often talk in business about kindness being a real strength to the company, but I genuinely think it is, because what you've experienced in turning up in this world that was alien to you, and you had something of a preconception towards what it might be, to see that it's not like that and it's just full of amazing people, is, you're now broadcasting to the world. You're telling people this. You're doing the PR for Formula One and for the Formula One teams. So I think this idea of kindness being an overriding factor, even in an intensely and furiously competitive environment, is a really important thing that I've certainly taken from Formula One, because I've experienced exactly the same. And it sounds like you are too.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way, a much more concise way of thinking about it, actually. That, it's kindness, isn't it? And so hopefully I can continue to pay that back as well to the paddock.
Yeah. And it may be that kindness that eventually fixes the sort of negative side of what you talked about with the online abuse. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's leave this then with your final pit lane life lesson that your time in Formula One or motorsport in general has left you with, that perhaps you're going to take away for the rest of your life, long since leaving this sport, that will always remain with you. And let's hear what it is for you.
I think, I've sort of covered off one of the life lessons that I was going to give, which is surround yourself with people who enable you to be the very best version of yourself and who have unwavering trust and faith in you. I think getting a community around you like that is a vital for life, not just in work or in sport. That is a life lesson to take away. And then equally tied to that, it's once you're in that environment where you feel safe and you have people around you who love you and trust you, be yourself. Be unadulteratedly you. and stay true to you as well. Have intent with everything you do, and a real authenticity in what you do as well.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's a wonderful thing that, definitely isn't just applicable. It is applicable in Formula One, but applicable outside, of course. It's the biggest team sport in the world. So surrounding yourself with the right people is a key part of how you succeed in Formula One, but it's equally true elsewhere. Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you,
this has
Mark.
been an amazing conversation. I could genuinely go on for hours talking about this. But I do think what you're doing is hugely important in the role that you're in. You're doing it incredibly well, as Will Buxton would not stop going on about.
I'm going to message him right now.
He talked about you being, growing into being one of his best friends. I can see that you are an incredibly nice person, which is a huge part of what we've been talking about. You're very, articulate in the way that you describe things. You're thoughtful about what you say, and this all comes across when people watch the broadcast. And that is exactly what we need as viewers to understand what is sometimes a really complicated sport, both technically, but also kind of politically and, from the sporting context as well, and everything that goes around it. And you manage to navigate through that in the clearest, most thoughtful, concise way possible. So I think you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and I will see you at Silverstone.
That is very kind, Mark. Thank you so much. I've absolutely loved this conversation. Some of these questions have been some of the best I've been asked in terms of being interviewed, which is unusual for me. So thank you very much for having me on. Absolute joy to chat.
Well, what a wonderful conversation that was, and what a lovely person. I hope you took a lot of things from that are applicable to your own lives, your businesses, whatever it is you're doing in life, to help you get a little bit closer to high performance. I thought Laura was lovely. Thank you, Laura, for being part of this. And for you at home, I would ask only one simple thing. If you can subscribe or follow or like, leave me a comment, leave me a 5-star review. However it is you're watching or listening to this, any of those interactions make a huge difference, and I really appreciate it. And until we speak again, do whatever you can to try and get closer to the mantra that I try and live my life by. Do the right things, do the things right.